The next two videos will be about making some of your parts a little more sophisticated. We'll start by doing that with the Modify toolbox. There's some really neat stuff in here that we can use to make some changes to our simple designs that we made in the last video. So let's start by making a rectangle. And I'm not really going to be concerned with the dimensions, so I'm just going to draw that. Now, before we get on to the Modify section, there's a few neat tricks that Inventor does for you, and we should take a look at those now. I've selected the Line tool, and perhaps I want to draw a line starting at the midpoint of one of the edges of the rectangle. Well, this little dot that follows me around, that's yellow all the time, will turn green when you hover over critical points. So that includes endpoints and the midpoint. So you can see it's yellow, 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 yellow till I reach the end, then it turns green. And when I hit the midpoint, it also turns green. So if I want to draw a line right from the midpoint, I can just left click on that green dot, go straight up. And if I wanted to go to the edge, I just move my cursor close to the edge till that dot turns green, and there we go. Now let's say I wanted to draw a line from this corner to the midpoint of this vertical line. I could do just that. Hover over until the cursor turns green. But I could also do something else that's pretty interesting. If I move my cursor to the left, I can see a dotted line appears, a horizontal dotted line appears. And as long as I keep my cursor on that line, as long as that line is visible, well then that means that I'm going up to the height of the midpoint of that vertical line. So if I go straight up and have that dotted line visible, well that means that this line I just drew has a height that corresponds to the height of the midpoint of this vertical line. So if I draw a horizontal line, I get right to that midpoint. So play around with it. Look for those line projections. Here's another one. If I go up to this point and move my cursor to the right, you can see that line projection. If I move off of it, it disappears. It means I'm no longer constrained to that point. But I move back down and it reappears. I know I'm at that height. So I can click and click again. And I can make some pretty nice shapes with that. Now let's look at some of these Modify tools, because we can also make some cool edits with those. First, let's look at some simple things like the Move button. If I highlight everything, I can choose to move it, and I select the base point just as the reference point of where I want to move it. So I click, and I can move my shape anywhere I want. Let's say that base point could be really useful if you want to move your shape in a certain way. For example, let me select everything and select the base point. Let's say I wanted the bottom left of this rectangle to be moved to where the top left corner of this rectangle is. And I wanted the whole shape to move that distance too. I can bottom click down here, set that as my base point, and then move the entire shape up there. I can do a very similar thing with the Copy tool. This time, it's like moving, except the old one stays where it is. Now let's try the Scale tool, another tool that's fairly simple and also utilizes the base point. Now, during this process, let's say I wanted to scale these shapes, and then maybe I decide I only want to scale the right one. Well, I just highlight the left one again to deselect it. Now let's use our base point. We click on the little arrow there. And our base point in the Scaling tool is the point that stays the same and fixed while everything else scales around it. So I'm going to scale with the base point at the bottom left corner. And I'm going to type in 2 to make it twice as big. And you can see that scale twice as big. Now let's look at what a different base point does. We can select the other rectangle, select a second base point. This time we will not select the bottom left corner, but the top right corner, and scale with a factor of 0.5, so 1/2. And you can see the top right corner remained the same while everything scaled to that. So we've looked at copy, move, scale. Let's look at one more thing that's not in the Modify toolbox, and that is the fillet button. This makes those sharp corners nice and rounded. The radius of those arcs is denoted here. So I start by clicking on the fillet tool. I'm going to stay with this default 0.125 inch radius. I'm going to click on my first line, click on my second line, and now if I zoom in, I see I have a really small radius there. Really small. Almost inconsequential. So what I'm going to have to do to make it more significant is make this a much bigger radius. Maybe 10. Click the equal sign, this line, and now we have a nice curve. Those old radiuses still exist, so we can just press the escape button to get our cursor back, and select them and click delete to get rid of them.